The judge didn't take her seriously. Not at first. When Pam Bondi walked into that courtroom, she saw it in his eyes. The quiet amusement, the subtle smirk. He had already decided how this would go. She wasn't the first attorney to stand before him, thinking she could challenge the system. And in his mind, she wouldn't be the last to fail. But Pam knew something he didn't. By the time this hearing was over, that smirk would be gone. The heavy doors of the Hillsborough County Courthouse creaked open, letting in a stream of warm air and a hush of murmurs from the hallway. Inside, the scent of aged paper and stale coffee hung in the air. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward the front, where Judge Richard Calloway sat perched behind his bench, flipping through a thick stack of legal documents. Pam entered with steady steps, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, because control in a courtroom didn't start with speaking. It started with presence. Across the aisle, Charles Merritt adjusted his silk tie with a slow, practiced motion. His face was calm, confident, the face of a man who had spent decades winning battles before they even began. He barely looked at Pam, as if acknowledging her would be giving her too much credit. The jury filed in next, taking their seats in silence. They were ordinary people, business owners, teachers, retirees, plucked from their daily lives and placed in the middle of something far bigger than they realized. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed. Others shifted uncomfortably, their expressions unreadable. Pam studied each one. She wasn't looking for faces. She was looking for instincts, who would be skeptical, who would be swayed, who would cling to logic, and who would trust emotion. All rise, the bailiff announced. Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone stood. Judge Calloway straightened his robe, glancing up from his paperwork with little interest. He waved a hand lazily. "Be seated." The courtroom obeyed. Then, he turned his gaze to Pam. "Miss Bondi," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I trust you're ready to proceed." Pam nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." Calloway exhaled, tapping his fingers against the bench. "Let's hope this doesn't turn into a circus," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the microphone to catch. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Merritt smirked. Pam didn't react. She simply placed her hand on her case file, fingers resting lightly on the cover. She had heard worse. She had faced worse. And she knew exactly how this was going to end. Charles Merritt rose from his seat with practiced ease, straightening his cuffs before stepping forward. He carried the air of a man who had done this 1,000 times, someone who knew exactly how to play the game. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, measured, almost amused. "This entire case is built on emotions rather than facts." He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes briefly flicking toward the jury as if inviting them to agree. "My client," he continued, placing a hand on the polished table, "is a well-respected financial institution that has always operated within the bounds of the law. Every contract was clearly outlined. Every term was fully disclosed." He glanced at Pam then, just for a second, a glint of condescension in his eyes before shifting his attention back to the judge. "The reality, Your Honor, is quite simple," Merritt said, spreading his hands as if explaining something obvious. "These individuals may not have fully understood what they were agreeing to, but that does not make my client responsible for their decisions." A few jurors exchanged glances. Some remained still, unreadable. Pam sat motionless, listening, waiting. "This is not fraud," Merritt continued, his tone dipping into something softer, more persuasive. "This is not deception. This is a misunderstanding, inflated into litigation." Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly as he leaned back. His fingers tapped idly against the desk, amusement flickering in his expression. "A misunderstanding," he echoed, tilting his head. "Are we really wasting the court's time over that, Miss Bondi?" Pam didn't respond. "Not yet." Merritt allowed himself a smirk, sensing the moment was his. "These cases happen all the time," he continued, addressing the jury now, letting his voice take on a reassuring lilt. "People sign contracts, later claim they didn't read the fine print, and look for someone to blame. But the law does not reward carelessness. He paced slightly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. "My client has done nothing wrong," he said, the confidence in his tone unwavering. "The company has followed regulations, upheld its commitments, and provided services exactly as outlined in their agreements." He turned back to the judge, spreading his hands once more. "The real issue here, Your Honor, is whether we allow the legal system to be used as a tool for those who regret their own financial choices." A faint chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery shifted, a murmur barely audible. Merritt stepped back, adjusting his tie as if sealing his victory. "This case should be dismissed immediately," he concluded, voice steady. "There is no fraud here, just misplaced blame." He returned to his seat with the same ease he had risen, confidence practically radiating from him. Judge Calloway turned his gaze toward Pam. "Well, Miss Bondi," he said, amusement still evident. "That's quite the argument. What do you have to say?" Pam finally moved, reaching for her file. She had heard enough. Pam didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence settle, stretching the moment until it became uncomfortable. The laughter had died down. The air in the room shifted, the light chatter in the gallery fading as eyes turned back to her. She reached for her file, moving slowly, deliberately, every motion precise. Then, without looking at the judge, she pulled out a single sheet of paper and stepped forward. "No misunderstanding, Your Honor," she said, placing the document on the bench. "Just evidence." Judge Calloway arched a brow but leaned forward anyway, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the page. The smirk he had worn moments ago tightened, barely noticeable, but enough. Pam turned, addressing the jury instead. "The defense claims my clients knew exactly what they were signing," she said, her voice steady. "But let's take a closer look." She lifted another page from her file, holding it up so the jury could see. "This is a clause from the contract," she continued, flipping to the highlighted section. "The company reserves the right to adjust annual fees based on projected market trends." She let the words hang, then shifted her eyes to Merritt. "That sounds harmless, doesn't it?" she asked. He didn't respond. She turned back to the jury. In reality, projected market trends were determined internally, without oversight. That meant the company could increase fees whenever they wanted, for any reason, without informing the customer until it was too late. A few jurors shifted, their expressions no longer neutral. Pam placed the document down and picked up another. "This one is worse," she said. "Section 22C. Customers who attempt to withdraw funds early are subjected to administrative penalties." She set the page on the desk in front of her, tapping the highlighted text. "That phrase is vague on purpose. In practice, those penalties were higher than the actual investment, leaving customers with nothing." Merritt shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie. The confidence he carried so effortlessly a moment ago wasn't as strong now. Pam saw it. Judge Calloway did too. The judge cleared his throat, looking at Merritt now. "Mr. Merritt, do you have a response to this?" Merritt straightened, forcing a small smile. "Your Honor, a single clause." Pam cut him off, her voice calm. "Not a single clause," she said, returning to her table. "A pattern." She picked up a thick stack of pages and placed them on the desk with a soft thud. "I have over 50 contracts," she said, turning back to the jury. "All with the same language, the same deceptive wording, the same intentional misdirection." For the first time, the weight of the case settled over the room. Judge Calloway wasn't smirking anymore. Pam reached into her file, her fingers steady, and pulled out a single page. Unlike the thick contracts she had presented before, this one was thin, just a few lines of text, but it carried more weight than anything else in the room. "This," she said, her voice clear, "is an internal memo from the defendant's own executives." She stepped forward, placing it in front of Judge Calloway. He adjusted his glasses and leaned in, his smirk finally gone. His eyes moved across the page, scanning the contents. Pam didn't wait for a reaction. She turned to the jury. The defense wants you to believe this was all a misunderstanding, she continued, holding up a copy of the same document. But this proves otherwise. She pointed to a highlighted section and read aloud. Delay disclosures for as long as legally possible. The words cut through the silence. She glanced at the jury. Some sat perfectly still, others shifted, their expressions tightening. This isn't an accident, Pam said, holding the paper higher. This isn't confusion. This is strategy. Merritt straightened in his seat. His fingers gripped the edge of his table, but he said nothing. Judge Calloway exhaled slowly and set the memo down. He looked at Merritt now, his gaze heavier than before. Mr. Merritt, do you have an explanation for this? Merritt's lips parted, but before he could speak, Pam reached for another file. Actually, before he answers, she said, placing a second document on the judge's bench, there's more. She unfolded a printed email thread, stapled neatly in a thick stack. These are internal emails, she said, flipping through the pages. Conversations between senior executives. Emails discussing how to word their contracts, how to mislead customers, how to protect themselves if someone figured it out. She flipped to a highlighted section. We need to ensure the fine print protects us against liability. Most won't read past the first page, so let's structure it carefully. She turned to another. If complaints escalate, offer partial refunds but never full ones. We need to maintain plausible deniability. She set the file down. Silence. A long, uncomfortable silence. Merritt pushed back in his chair, shifting his weight. His usual calm had cracked, if only slightly. Pam let the moment linger. Then she turned back to the jury. This wasn't about providing a service, she said, her voice softer now, measured. This was about trapping people. About making sure no one had a way out. She walked back to her table, picking up a different set of files. I have copies of these emails, she said, spreading them out. Every single one of them. Dated, time-stamped, direct from their own servers. She met the judge's gaze. No confusion, Your Honor. Just proof. Judge Calloway inhaled deeply, his fingers tapping against his chair's armrest. His smirk was long gone. In its place, something else, something closer to concern. He turned to Merritt. Mr. Merritt. Merritt opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head slightly before clearing his throat. With all due respect, Your Honor, this so-called memo. Pam cut in, her voice calm. The memo that came from a whistleblower, she asked. The one confirmed by multiple employees. Merritt exhaled sharply, trying to gather himself. Even if these documents are real. They are, Pam interjected. He ignored her. They don't prove intentional fraud. Pam took a step closer. Don't they? She asked, holding up another email. Or do you need me to read the part where they discuss how long they can delay payouts before legal action is possible? Merritt didn't answer. Pam let her words sink in, then turned back to the judge. Your Honor, she said, this company didn't just mislead people. They planned it. They executed it. And they counted on never getting caught. She stepped back, hands clasped behind her back. Judge Calloway sighed, rubbing his forehead. For the first time since the hearing started, the weight of the case was fully in the room. Pam had turned the tide. And everyone knew it. Judge Calloway leaned back, his fingers pressed together as he studied the documents in front of him. The amusement that once danced in his eyes had faded completely. The weight of the evidence sat between them, undeniable and impossible to ignore. Merritt cleared his throat, adjusting his tie in a way that was meant to look casual, but wasn't. Your Honor, he began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. These so-called emails are time-stamped. Pam cut in, her tone steady. Pulled directly from internal servers. Verified. Judge Calloway turned toward Merritt, lifting an eyebrow. Go on, he said, voice sharp. Merritt hesitated. His mind was working, searching for a way out. He had spent years twisting words, bending rules, making problems disappear before they ever became real threats. But this, this was different. The usual tricks weren't landing. The room wasn't on his side anymore. He swallowed, squared his shoulders, and tried again. Even if these documents are legitimate, he said, forcing an easy grin, they don't prove intent. Pam didn't rush to respond. She let the silence work for her, let the jury sit with what they had just heard. Then she took a slow step forward, gathering the scattered pages on her desk. Intent, she echoed, flipping through them as if searching for something. Then she stopped, lifting one sheet into the air. Let's talk about intent. She turned to the jury, her voice softer now, measured. The defense wants you to believe this was just poor communication, a misunderstanding. But let me ask you, she paused, locking eyes with a man in the second row. If someone creates a contract that guarantees they win, no matter what happens, is that an accident? She let the question hang. If a company buries fees in the fine print, structures penalties in a way that leaves customers with nothing, deliberately delays disclosures, she glanced at the judge, is that just business? The jury was no longer still. A woman in the front row crossed her arms, her lips pressed tight. Another man shifted in his chair, eyes narrowed. Pam turned back to Merritt. These executives sat in boardrooms, she said, voice steady but unshakable, knowing exactly what they were doing, deciding exactly how much they could take before someone fought back. Merritt opened his mouth, but no words came. Pam didn't stop. They didn't expect resistance, she continued. They counted on silence, on fear, on fine print so confusing, no one would question it. She stepped toward the judge's bench, resting a single document in front of him. This isn't speculation, Your Honor, she said, calm but firm. It's written in their own words. Calloway exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers on the desk. Then, without looking at Merritt, he spoke. Objection overruled, he said, voice firm. Merritt stiffened. His hands curled slightly on the table. He had lost control, and he knew it. Pam turned back to the jury. 4 years, they've operated like this, she said, letting the truth settle in the air. And if this court lets them walk away now, we're telling every corporation in the country that they can do the same. Silence. Judge Calloway didn't smirk. He didn't joke. He simply nodded. The court will proceed. Pam had turned the tide. And this time, there was no turning back. Judge Calloway leaned forward, his fingers pressing against the papers spread before him. His expression was unreadable, but the weight in his tone left no doubt. Mr. Merritt, he said, his voice measured. Do you have an actual legal argument, or are we just wasting time? Merritt straightened in his chair, clearing his throat. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something closer to discomfort. He reached for his pen, tapping it against the table in slow, deliberate beats. Your Honor, he started, his voice thinner than before, these documents, this so-called memo, its authenticity is questionable at best. Pam barely blinked. She turned, picking up a second stack of papers, this one thicker than the last. No, she said, flipping through the pages. It's not. She handed the file to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. These, she continued, addressing the room, are time-stamped emails, pulled directly from their internal servers. Verified. Merritt's jaw tightened, his hands clasping together as he tried to maintain control. Judge Calloway skimmed the first few pages. The further he read, the deeper his frown became. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at Merritt. Go on, the judge said, his tone sharper now. Merritt's lips parted, but nothing came out. He shifted in his seat, searching for words that weren't there. Pam let the silence stretch. Then she took a slow step forward, her voice calm but firm. The defense has spent this entire hearing dismissing my clients, she said, calling this a misunderstanding, blaming them for signing contracts designed to deceive. She turned slightly, looking at the jury. But we now have proof, she continued, that these executives didn't just hope customers wouldn't understand the fine print. They counted on it. She flipped to another page, tapping a section highlighted in bold. This email, she read, states, if clients push back, remind them they signed the agreement. Delay payouts when possible. Do not confirm misleading language in writing. Pam looked up, directly at Merritt. That isn't an accident, she said. That's intent. Merritt inhaled sharply, shifting his hands as if trying to find something to hold on to. Judge Calloway tapped his fingers against the bench, slower this time. Mr. Merritt, he said, voice low but firm. Anything to add? Merritt hesitated. The room waited. The jury watched. Finally, he exhaled, straightened his tie, and shook his head. No, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, studying Merritt for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Motion to dismiss is denied. Pam didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had already won. The gavel's final strike echoed through the courtroom, but Pam didn't linger. She gathered her files, moving with the same steady purpose she had when she first entered. There was no need for celebration. This was just the beginning. She stepped away from the plaintiff's table, her gaze unwavering. The air felt different now, heavier with the weight of what had just happened. Judge Calloway's smirk was long gone. His expression, once dismissive, now held something else, something closer to reluctant respect. Merritt sat frozen, his fingers gripping the edge of his legal pad. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he reached for his phone, his movements tense. Pam knew exactly what was happening. His clients were already calling, already panicking. The damage control had begun. But there was nothing they could do now. The truth was out. She didn't look back as she walked through the heavy courtroom doors. Outside, the scene was chaos. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices clashing as they threw questions her way. Miss Bondi, what do you think of the judge's ruling? Do you believe this case will go to trial? Do you expect a settlement? Cameras flashed. Microphones hovered close. But Pam didn't stop. Her focus wasn't on them. It was on the group of people waiting just beyond the crowd, her clients. Ordinary men and women who had spent years being ignored, dismissed, pushed aside by a system designed to work against them. An older woman, wrapped in a faded blue cardigan, stepped forward hesitantly. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Does this mean we have a chance? Pam met her gaze, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then, for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small smile. Yes, she said simply. You do. The woman pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes glistening. A few others murmured their thanks. Some nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Pam didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. This was why she did what she did. Behind her, Merritt moved briskly down the steps, his phone pressed to his ear. His jaw was tight, his expression blank, but the tension in his posture said it all. Pam turned back to her clients. This isn't over, she told them. Not yet. But today, you made them listen. And that was where real change started.